Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm not from upstairs like you guys can claim. I'm actually from the other place. I spent 7 years at Cambridge studying for an undergrad, master's, and PhD in English literature. Any English students out there? Yeah, come on, more noise from the English students, please. That's very whimpering from the English students. And while I was at the other place, I met some really intelligent people from all over the world. In particular, I met a guy who is now a professor of the natural sciences at Harvard. He's so clever that he's not even defined just by one science subject. He's like professor of the natural sciences because he's that clever. And he and I became good friends in the UK. We spent a lot of our time arguing about God because my friend is a sort of atheist, culturally Jewish atheist, and I was and am a Christian. And a few years ago, I took this friend to an event at Harvard where the agnostic chairman of the Harvard philosophy department was in dialogue with a New Testament scholar called N.T. Wright. And the title of the event was The Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage, which is American for rubbish, if you don't know. And after the event, I said to my friend, I know that you think what I believe is crazy. His then girlfriend, who was a much gentler soul than either of us, said, oh, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around a first-century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend said, yes. I said, the problem is, I think that you believe some crazy things as well. As I mentioned, my friend is a world-class scientist. And one of the reasons that he would have for thinking that my belief as a Christian is crazy is the sheer success of modern science. For many in our world today, and perhaps for many people in this room now, the success of modern science feels like a massive signpost pointing away from the claim of a creator God in general and of Christianity in particular. But in our short time today, I want to suggest that rather than being a massive signpost pointing away from God, that science is actually an invitation to find out more about the Creator God. So I want to make 4 points in our time. Number one, science wasn't based on atheism. Number two, science hasn't disproved creation. Number three, science doesn't exclude miracles. And number four, science cannot tell us who we are. So number one, science wasn't based on atheism. I mentioned yesterday to those who were here the way that Richard Dawkins and his fellow new atheists have shaped people's thinking in the last couple of decades. And one of the big messages that Richard Dawkins and his new atheist friends have been getting out over the years is the idea that science is somehow an alternative hypothesis to belief in a creator God. In fact, for many of Richard Dawkins' ilk, the more that we understand of science, the less God becomes relevant or credible. And what's more, the foundational basics of science, like the scientific method, is based on a functional atheism. I can see how that logic goes. You know, those of you who are scientists in this room and those of you even who aren't know that scientists aren't going about looking for supernatural explanations. In fact, one of the basic principles of science is to look for natural causes for natural phenomena. So it seems reasonable to say, well, this is by definition excluding God. And that science is at its heart based on functional atheism. But actually, if you look at the history of how the modern scientific method was developed, you'll find quite an opposite story. Rather than being an alternative hypothesis to belief in a creator God, the people who first framed the scientific method, the people who drove the scientific revolution, did so because they believed in the God of the Bible who was both rational and free. Now, don't take my word for it. I'm just an English student, right? So what do I know? I have a friend who's a professor at Princeton University in America, quite a good university if you know much about universities in America. Hans Halvorsen, he is a professor of maths and of philosophy, and he's probably one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world. And he explains that the people who were first sort of framing and shaping what we now call science looked to the Bible for their understanding of the creator of the universe. And that was how they actually got some of their ideas about the natural world. You see, they reasoned that if there is one creator God of all the world, not just a whole bunch of different gods, but one creator God of all the world, then we could expect some degree of consistency between how the natural world works in one place and another. They knew from the Bible that the creator God is rational, a rational law-giving God. And so they thought, probably if this God was creating the world, he would create it according to rational principles or laws. And because the Bible says that human beings are made in the image of this creator God, that actually we, image-bearing creatures, might be able to figure out what those laws or principles underlying the universe are. But they also believed that the God of the Bible is completely free. He could have made the universe any way he liked. And so if we're going to find out what those underlying laws and principles of the universe are, we have to go and look. Now that in layman's terms is the basis of the empirical method, of going and kind of conducting experiments, figuring out how things work and expecting them to work consistently every time, regardless of where we are in the world. So in its first sort of framing and philosophical foundation, science wasn't actually based on atheism, it was based on theism. And Hans Halvorsen, as I said, world-class philosopher of science, says that even today, science rests more firmly on theistic foundations than on atheistic ones. In fact, he says atheism doesn't give you a philosophical foundation for science at all. Now, let's go back for a minute to that idea that when we go into the lab, those of us who do, we're not looking for supernatural causes to natural phenomena, we're looking for natural causes. So just to go back to that, doesn't that mean that we're sort of excluding God from the picture? Well, no, the point is not that only some natural phenomena are caused by supernatural causes, so we can kind of look for those. But actually the point is that every natural phenomenon is ultimately caused by supernatural causes. And at the same time, every natural phenomenon is caused by natural causes. As one professor of physics, Russell Calburn, who I'm sorry again is from Cambridge University and therefore probably doesn't garner your respect, he's a professor of experimental physics there. And he says, the more we understand of science doesn't make God smaller. It allows us to see his creative activity in more detail. So our first point, science isn't based on atheism. Second point, science hasn't disproved creation. Now, again, for some period of time, there have been some atheists, and actually also some Christians, who have taken the approach to science and questions of faith of saying, if there are things where we can't figure out a scientific cause or explanation, that's where we're going to point to God's activity. And they've done this especially when it comes to the study of the beginnings of the world and the study of the origins of human beings. There have been all these sort of debates and controversies between some Christians and some scientists where they're sort of arguing over whether there are gaps in the scientific record in various ways. And if we can establish that there's a gap, that's where God is sort of intervening. And if we close up that gap from the atheist perspective, then we can kind of eliminate God. But actually, that is a fundamental theological misunderstanding. Because the God of the Bible isn't just a God who made the world and then sort of put up a sign saying, be back in 14 billion years. He's actually a God who made the universe and sustains it every minute, every second, every nanosecond of every day. This isn't a God who just sort of set things up to tick along. This is a God who is intimately involved in his creation at every point. But again, because he is a law-giving, consistent God, We can depend on him to uphold his universe in a consistent way. Now you might say, well, let's look back at the history of science over the last 400 or so years. And think of all those times when there have been these sort of famous controversies, famous debates between Christians on the one hand and scientists on the other. And isn't it the case that in every situation, the scientists have won against the Christians? Sort of there's been a Christian retreat in the face of science. I want to make two comments on that. The first is that if you look closely at every seeming sort of controversy between scientists and Christians, you will actually find very serious Christians on both sides of the debate. You'll find that in all the fields historically that have been supposed to disprove or discredit creation, you'll actually find there are very serious Christian scientists who've been leading the charge historically, and actually around the world today. I worked for almost 9 years with Christian professors at leading secular universities, including places like Oxford. And in every single field that is supposed to have disproved or discredited the Christian faith, I know world-class leaders who are very serious Christians. So number one, you'll find Christians on both sides of the table in all of these supposed science versus Christianity debates. And number two, it's actually not the case that in every situation, the Christian view has been the one that sort of had to retreat while the scientist's view sort of prevails. A very interesting example of this is what we now call the Big Bang. It was first conceived by a Belgian Roman Catholic priest. He first talked about it as a cosmic egg, the idea that the universe, rather than always existing, had started at this sort of one point of incredible energy and sort of exploded from there. And he was laughed at by many in the scientific establishment, partly because his theory sounded completely crazy, and partly, as Stephen Hawkins comments, because it sounded rather too much like the biblical account of creation when God says, "Let there be light." You see, according to the Christian story, the universe isn't eternal. There was a beginning. And that now actually is very much the sort of scientific consensus. There was this beginning at the Big Bang. Now, of course, those of you who are interested in these kinds of questions will know that people like Stephen Hawkins would then say, well, actually, the principles, these laws that undergird the universe are all that was required for creation to happen. We didn't need any kind of divine breathing into these laws. They just will create the universe by themselves. And then we end up in all these conversations about, well, where did these laws come from? This idea that the universe had a beginning, as they say, strongly consistent with a Christian view, and actually makes very good sense of a scientific account of the origins of the universe today. So science hasn't disproved creation. Third point, science doesn't exclude miracles. Now, when I said to my scientist friend that he thought that what I believed was crazy, one of the things I was pointing to is the fundamental Christian claim that this first century Jewish man, Jesus of Nazareth, was not only crucified by the Romans, but on the third day that he rose again from the dead. Christianity is a fundamentally supernaturalist belief system, making embarrassing claims about miracles, not only the miracles supposedly worked by Jesus, but in particular, I'm trying not to fall off the stage here, in particular, the miracle of Jesus' resurrection. This is the foundational historical claim of the Christian faith. And if Jesus was not raised from the dead, then Christianity is a waste of time and energy. So how could a scientist, or just somebody like all of you who is sort of scientifically educated, whether or not that's your sort of chosen vocation, how can we modern 21st century scientifically literate people take seriously the claim of miracles in general and the resurrection in particular? Well, this is where I'm going to appeal to another guy from the other place, a man named Ian Hutchinson, who's now a professor at MIT in the US, near where I live. Ian was raised not in a particularly religious family, He became a Christian himself when he was undergraduate at Cambridge University. He was baptized on his 21st birthday. And he has written a book with the title, Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles?, looking precisely at this question. And what Ian explains is that because the God that Christians believe in is the God who, as I say, not only created the universe once upon a time, but actually sustains it today, when Christians are talking about miracles, they're not talking about God just sort of popping in and doing something when usually he leaves his creation be. No, we're talking about the God who sustains the entire universe at all times and in all places, sustaining his universe, as Ian puts it, in a slightly different way at a particular time for a particular reason. And in fact, Ian explains that the processes of science, the way that we conduct science, is trying to figure out the repeatable patterns that we see in the universe. Science is specifically not equipped to look at miracles because miracles are by definition not repeatable events. So the methods of science can neither sort of prove nor disprove whether a miracle happened. So how can we even look at the data and the evidence for that? Well, Ian says we have to look at the methods of history. Hopefully we've got some historians in the room here. You'll know that you use different tools to assess historical claims than you do to assess scientific claims. And much of science is fantastic and has delivered all sorts of wonderful things in terms of our knowledge and capacities. Science is not the only tool by which we can assess truth. So science cannot disprove or discredit miracles. We have to look with different kinds of tools to see whether that central claim of the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus Christ bodily from the dead, actually took place or not. And again, I know world-class scientists in a whole range of fields who believe passionately that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. And they don't hold this as sort of, turning their scientific minds off, but recognizing that not all truth is truth that should be assessed by the tools of science. So that's our third point. Science doesn't exclude miracles. And fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, science cannot tell us who we are. A few years ago, I went to an event at MIT where we had two Christian professors and two atheists, one atheist and one agnostic professor, talking about what they most fundamentally believed and why. And one of the non-Christian professors, who's in the physics department, stood up and he said this: our consciousness and our self-awareness create the illusion that we are made out of some sort of special substance, that we have some special ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence, when in reality we are nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. We are stuff, he went on, like donuts. Those of you who were here last night and heard my friend Niv speaking, heard another way that this was put, I think, by Stephen Hawking, describing us humans as chemical scum. So is that all we are? Are you and I only what the tools of science can show that we are? There are two ways of looking at that question. There's one which says, okay, I'm going to try and use the tools of science to figure out some gaps in a scientific account of me. Am I just atoms and molecules? Well, maybe if we weigh me, we'll find that there's a sort of piece that's unaccounted for, and we'll call that the soul, and we'll say, no, she's not just atoms and molecules. We kind of know that's not really the right approach to understanding what a human being is. But just as at a scientific level, you can actually understand the whole of who I am at different levels, so we need to understand that human beings have an identity that goes beyond what science can tell us. You could analyze every inch of my body and find that I am only composed of atoms and molecules. But then a biologist would come along and say, oh, no, she's actually a mammal. I have 3 children. There's plenty of evidence that I'm a mammal. But in addition to that, I'm also a being created in the image of the Creator God. And even if you are not somebody who believes in God yourself, my guess is that if I asked who you are, you wouldn't just give me your sort of your weight or your height or your DNA. You wouldn't give me a scientific analysis. You would tell me about your relationships. You would tell me about your dreams and hopes and fears and desires and interests. Because who we are cannot be reduced to our atoms and molecules. I think at heart we all know that. But if we say that science is the only tool that we are going to allow ourselves to use to understand the truth, we have to exclude that. When I said to my scientist friend, I think that you believe some crazy things as well, what I had particularly in mind was that on the one hand, he thinks that scientific truth is the only sort of universal objective truth that we have. And on the other hand, he actually believes deeply in universal human rights and equality. He believes deeply that there are moral rights and wrongs that he needs to live by. He can't conclude any of that simply from his science. But if we go back to that understanding of creation that those first framers of the scientific revolution had, we'll find that the God who made the universe is also the God who made every single one of us and who calls us to be in a relationship with him. We'll find some incredibly bad news, actually, that all of us have turned our backs on this God and that we actually rightly deserve his judgment against us. I know that's an incredibly sort of unpopular and countercultural thing to say, but it's the very clear message of the Bible. And when I am honest and I look into my own heart, I find an awful lot that doesn't give me confidence in my own goodness before a perfectly holy, beautiful, good Creator God. But the Bible also gives us incredibly good news. That this man, Jesus of Nazareth, is the Son of that God. He's in fact the one through whom all things were made. And despite his divinity, he became a human being in order that he could die in your and my place and be raised again so you and I could live with him forever. So I said at the beginning, this is a crazy thing to believe. And I understand if you have many questions that I haven't even started to answer today. But at the end of the day, if there is no God, if you are not made in the image of that God, if you are not created with intention and with purpose, if you are not created for love and for life, then you and I are nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. I think we can have 5 minutes now for you guys to have some chat around your tables before we have Q&A. So I'll shut up for a minute and let you guys talk.